if I were to start this day of talks, which cover a considerable historical period, the whole of the 20th century, and while it can hardly be entirely global, it does touch on several continents. I would probably want to begin with some comment on the historiography, which is the prerogative of every academic. And I suppose one way to investigate the underlying ideology or worldview of the revivalist urge in the 20th century would be to identify those patterns in historical scholarship and methodology that could be regarded as informing or validating revivalist taste. Now, in this, there are many examples, and not least the pioneering figures of art, architectural, and design history, who shaped these disciplines in the final decades of the 19th century and the early decades of the 20th century. And I'm sure everyone in the room knows who I'm talking about here. Wolflin, who established the principle of style as being the principal area of research for art and architectural historians, and also developed patterns of analysing style as the key way of interpreting style, social, economic, and aesthetic change. There's alongside him Alois Riegel, who of course transferred much of this emphasis in style not to a cyclical process, but to one much closer to a Darwinian notion of evolution, of ever-changing, evolving styles, which in the famous analogy that an item or a form which appeared first in a classical statue will eventually reappear hundreds of years later as an abstract pattern in a Mesopotamian carpet. These are the raw materials of historiography that we all know. But I do want to mention also Dvorak in this, who was Riegel's successor in Vienna, partly because 3 of the talks today will be addressing Central Europe. And Dvorak's rather important in this, although he's generally overshadowed by the others, partly because it was Dvorak who revalidated certain periods and gave them a degree of prestige in the early 20th century, above all Mannerism and the Baroque. And for Central European designers, curators, and historians, this was an important act which brought those period styles back into respectability and therefore made them accessible to designers. Now, these are clearly very important insights into the ways that the past was seen and how periods or styles of the past were understood. This identification of recognizable period styles is significant, and it links to the larger theories of cultural development. But there is a gap between the generation of cultural history models and the ways in which period styles were understood by consumers of the goods that were made or designed in those styles. The gap, if you like, between theory and practice, or theory and consumption. Those buying neo-Baroque dining furniture were not reading Wolflin, any more than the decoration of a neo-Rococo interior was informed by Dvorak. So if we take an example, which I'm just pulling out here to explore something of the complexity of meaning in a particular context. If we look at the example in the Czech lands, this may help us to recognize how complex style and revivalism are when one attempts to analyze it in closer detail. In the years before and immediately after the First World War, the dominant progressive modern style in the fine and decorative arts in Prague was so-called Czech Cubism. The fact that it was allied to a nationalist movement and promoted by an educated middle-class community within the Czech elite also gives us plenty to hang on to, because like most nationalist and avant-garde groups, the Cubists were keen to theorize their aims and stylistic choices, seeking to trace its origins and meaning to models or sources that flattered the ethnic community they were seeking to unite. In the case of Czech Cubism, there were three very different and often conflicting sources. The first, contemporary avant-garde art from a metropolitan centre like Paris. Secondly, a mystical preoccupation with crystalline forms as an expression of man's struggle against nature. And third, an emphasis on forms and styles that had emerged, and I quote, from an impulse deep within the cultural history of the Czech peoples. Now, these three do not sit happily together, but they were concurrent. And at various stages in this relatively short period, they were seen as uppermost. Now, the first of these, alignment with Cubism in Paris, had certain formal and theoretical preoccupations, best seen in Pavel Janak's theory of superimposition of plane and space. There were, of course, important collections of Cubist art in Prague. But apart from any stated link between the two parallel movements, Cubism as it was perceived in Paris and Cubism as it was understood in Prague, there were other more pressing socio-political forces at work. We can, if we look at Janak or Hoffmann's furniture, recognise the way in which overlapping planes, interpenetration of planes, might be translated from pictorial conventions into three-dimensional furniture. But I have to say I find that really superficial and rather gratuitous. Instead, I think it's much more useful to look at the political forces at work. Metropolitan avant-gardism, with a focus on Paris, had significant appeal both before and after the creation of the new state of Czechoslovakia in 1918, because it was an assertion of cultural independence from the Germanic Habsburg rulers of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. In addition, there was an ongoing struggle within Bohemia and Moravia for cultural hegemony in the emergent state between the indigenous Germans, who had traditionally been the dominant educated class, and the aspirant Czech-speaking nationalists. In this, the Czech lands are similar to nationalist and independence movements in many regions of the Habsburg Empire, although particularly polarized in the Czech lands. Around 1900, the two rival communities of Czechs and Germans built rival concert halls, theatres, clubs, and social contexts. Indeed, there is to this day 2 national theatres and 2 national concert halls in Prague, because the two communities refused to mix. This meant that the ethnic groups remained distinctly apart, physically as well as culturally. In this context, foreign cultural alliances were deeply meaningful and tended to be stimulated as much by disaffection for one power as opposed to any aesthetic or cultural attraction. The emphasis on French avant-garde culture gave Czech Cubism a strongly Czech and nationalist emphasis, in opposition to the traditional values of the Germans. There was also a glamour associated with cosmopolitanism, linking the Czech nationalists with contemporary aesthetic cultural values, and putting Prague into a network of capital cities at the forefront of modern ideas, bypassing Vienna, Berlin, and the other major centres of Germanic culture. This attitude carried on into the founding doctrines of the new state of Czechoslovakia under Thomas Masaryk, who emphasized that Czechoslovakia would be, quote, a modern state and its institutions would be reformed and renovated to reflect this liberal outlook. Prague was invented as a modern capital city in opposition to the German models which had previously dominated. Now, the second aspect, a preoccupation with crystalline forms, quote, as an expression of man's struggle against nature, might be seen as a branch of the late symbolist and expressionist current that was particularly strong in Central Europe. The Czech Cubists were enthusiastic supporters of this on both a mystical and a formal level, best seen in a series of designs for domestic items that they believed harnessed the power of crystalline forms through the marshalling of elemental shapes, especially the square and the triangle, which combined in their view to form a pyramid, the most perfect and stable elemental form, which I think when you look at the Gottschalk's clock, and especially Janak's ceramic box, you can perhaps understand the extent to which they felt they were bringing these quasi-mystical ideas deeply into the domestic environment. The third strand in the sources and meanings of Czech Cubist design, however, is the emphasis on forms and styles that had emerged from, if I repeat my quote, from an impulse deep within the cultural history of the Czech peoples. This is best expressed by Janak himself in his most famous essay, The Prism and the Pyramid. And if we look at the ways in which so much Czech Cubist architecture looks directly back to indigenous vernacular sources, particularly the rural or folk Baroque, which I think you can read here, one might recognize the extent to which their stated modernism and cosmopolitanism was nevertheless rooted in a deeply local, provincial, and historic indigenous source. In this case, he makes it quite clear. Our local architecture has been determined by two large European architectural families, Southern antiquity and that of Northern Christianity. The Southern spirit developed its full potential above all in the Baroque, a period again controlled by abstraction. It was typical of our national character. Historicism, in other words, becomes an expression of the aspirant nationalism of the Czech peoples. Now, here we are approaching one of the key areas of revivalism, the concept of national styles, or at least historic styles that were theorized in the late 19th and early 20th century as somehow unique or distinctive to one ethnic group as opposed to another. This is bound up with the rise of nationalism, obviously, but equally given a voice or justification through the recently established discipline of ethnography, then as now a highly politicized activity and one which is freely used by different ethnic, national and other groups to further their ends in an area quite separate from the academy. Now, this is not simply a matter of nostalgia or a forced adoption of period styles for narrow political ends, but a repurposing of the past using familiar tropes to validate certain values in a later modern context. In that sense, revivalism can be seen also as an attempt to re-establish certain indigenous forms for modern consumption. Now, when we look at some of the key examples of Czech Cubist furniture, one notices the facetting of forms which we can relate to their crystalline obsession. One can also see it linked somehow to the facetting and planar treatment of Cubist art and interiors. But the abiding impression that one gets in looking at much Cubist furniture is the extent to which its massive solidity harks back to 17th and 18th century Baroque furniture. Also, Czech Cubist furniture rarely, if ever, sought to reorientate the domestic space. Invariably, it reaffirmed the role of furniture as symbolic or totemic object rather than altering the use and patterns of domestic life. To look at Janak's commode or Gottschalk's writing desk, one is reminded of the role of furniture in the Baroque and later interiors more as static symbolic patterns rather than objects of use. And this becomes even more explicit when one analyses the large-scale furniture that was produced during and particularly after the war, where the historical references are quite explicit. These are examples that I'd simply assembled in a fairly random manner to make a simple point. And yet the examples of the sources are quite clear, as one recognises here. Now, this pattern might therefore, as I've said, be a way of bringing back the historic styles to a modern audience where they are given renewed meaning in a particular historical and social context. But I don't want us to, or I don't want to put forward a view that somehow this should revalidate historicism. I have to confess that my approach to it is still very much rooted in an essentially modernist attitude. And so looking at the Legio Bank by Joseph Gottschalk, I'd see less of the Cubist references and the crystalline forms, but instead the reworking of a very traditional repertoire of decorative forms that date back to the 16th and 17th century, albeit stylized, simplified, but with unmistakable references to their historic sources. And for that reason, I want to emphasize that even revivalism at the time remains a highly contested area. For every dominant nationalist group who are finding validation for their revivalist styles throughout the 20th century, thankfully there is also the counterbalance of modernists who attack this virulently. And I couldn't resist putting in Karel Teige's view of the Czech Cubists, where, as you can see here, he points out that their principle was delusional, and that they stood for a form of design that was entirely misunderstood. Teige was an unreconstructed modernist, not that he had to reconstruct himself in the 1920s, but for him, Czech Cubism represented a reactionary step which he believed was nationalist as opposed to internationalist, historicist instead of modern, and indeed narrow-minded rather than expansive. So I don't want you to go away thinking that we're following one line or another here, just to emphasize that the revivalist urge in any period is hotly contested, and the layers of meaning beneath it deserve to be excavated and brought out when we're looking at those styles. Style is not an end in itself. Even Wolflin said that. It is there to be interrogated as much in the original form as in its revivalist form. So I hope you will enjoy today's talks, and we will be examining many of these topics over the next several hours. Thank you.